Good morning, everyone, and I welcome you all to the 5th meeting of 2020 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones, or at the very least put them to silent, please, so we don't disturb the meeting. No apologies this morning. Shona Robinson, MSP, is a bit delayed this morning. Hopes to be with us as soon as she can. She's got other commitments in committees elsewhere this morning. And we move to agenda item 1, decision to take items in private. And the committee is asked to agree to take item 3, consideration of evidence in private. Is the committee agreed to do so? Okay, thank you. We move to agenda item 2, budget scrutiny 2020-2021. The committee will take evidence on the Scottish Government's budget for the forthcoming financial year, including the revised Social Security Programme business case published on the 12th of February. And can I welcome Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People. Thank you very much for coming along, Cabinet Secretary. And to your team, Kevin Stevens, Head of Strategic and Performance Finance, Social Security Director at Scottish Government, Alison Byrne, Deputy Director, Social Security Programme Delivery Support, Scottish Government, and James Wallace, Deputy Director, Finance and Corporate Services, Social Security Scotland. Thank you everyone for coming along to support our scrutiny of the Scottish Government's budget this morning. And we'll move to an opening statement from the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Good morning, Convener. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about the Social Security budget, as this is a landmark year in the devolution of Social Security benefits, and April 2020 will see £3 billion in benefit spend transferred to the Scottish Government. It is a key milestone in our journey to deliver a social security system based on dignity, fairness and respect. The total budget allocation for the Social Security and Older People portfolio is £3.8 billion. This includes £3.4 billion in forecast benefit expenditure, which will reach approximately 800,000 people, making a real difference to their lives. Turning to some specific benefits, over £220 million has been paid out via the Scottish Welfare Fund to more than 357,000 households in crisis since it was introduced in the 1st of April 2013. As the committee knows, the fund is under pressure in many parts of the country because of the increasing demand that is being brought about by deep UK government welfare cuts and the continuing effects of austerity. Therefore, we are allocating an additional £3 million in funding to further support this vital fund for people who need it. That is an increase of almost 8%. This will enable local authorities to continue with the positive work they do to help the most vulnerable in our communities. As set out in the programme for government, we're also committing a further £2 million in discretionary housing payments to support care-experienced young people. This is in addition to our continued commitment to fully mitigate the effects of the bedroom tax through nearly £60 million of funding, and the funding of £10.9 million for other discretionary housing payments, including support for those affected by local housing allowance rates and the benefit cap. Funeral support payment helps alleviate the burden of debt clients may face when paying for a funeral, and so help to reduce funeral poverty. We have already committed additional funds to support the widening eligibility that we introduced here in Scotland. In addition to this, we have increased the standard rate from £700 to £1,000 to support people even further. This benefit is expected to support a total of 5,000 people each year. The effects of this payment were highlighted recently by some feedback from a funeral director who said that they were amazed at the speed of the decisions and how quickly payments are coming through. This is making a huge difference to the state of mind of our clients who are worried about what to do about the bill if it takes a long time for that payment to come through. This is extremely positive and is yet another demonstration of how we are already making a real difference to the lives of the people of Scotland. The committee is aware that we will not take an austerity-led, target-driven approach where all that matters is driving down the cost of supporting those who need it. Therefore, we recognise that there are risks associated with demand-led spend on this scale. Forecast variation, either up or down in demand-led spending, could potentially have a wide impact on the Scottish budget. For example, a 10% variation in forecast for 2021 is over £300 million. We are working with stakeholders and experts across the Scottish Government to develop processes and procedures which will enable the effective management of those risks, both in year and for future years. Moving to the benefits being introduced in the financial year 2021, Job Start Payment is a brand new benefit that will be launched in spring 2020. It will help young people aged 16 to 24 who have been out of paid employment and in receipt of an eligible benefit for 6 months or more. And it will be a one-off payment of £250 or £400 if a young person has children to cover the cost of transport to work, clothes or food. Care leavers can claim until they are 25. It's expected to help around 5,000 young people. Applications for child disability payment will open in the summer of 2020, and we will ensure that young people, carers, parents and guardians can navigate the process of applying for and maintaining their benefit by phone, online or by post, a medium of their choosing. Additionally, from winter 2020, children in receipt of the highest rate of the care component of child disability payment will receive child winter heating assistance, an annual payment of £200. This will help an estimated 16,000 families with severely disabled children and young people to ensure that they can maintain a consistent temperature in their homes throughout the winter. From spring 2021, we will deliver extra financial support to people in receipt of carers' allowance who are caring for more than one disabled child, in recognition of the impacts of this on carers' health, well-being and ability to work and have a life outside caring. We are working with carers and stakeholders now to develop this new support. Autumn 2020 will see the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, a brand new payment for families with children aged under 6. Up to 170,000 children will be eligible for these early payments. In line with Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts, 21 million has been allocated by the Scottish Government for benefit expenditure in 2020-21. The payment will be a preventative measure to mitigate further cuts, as well as fundamentally shifting the curve on poverty. It will be fully rolled out to eligible families with children aged under 16 by the end of 2022. And once fully rolled out, the payment will benefit 410,000 children and reduce child poverty by 3 percentage points, lifting 30,000 children out of poverty, a significant increase to our children and families. Investment in our children and families. Lastly, we are committed to launching disability assistance for working age people in early 2021. Our priority is the safe and secure transfer of disability assistance, which means in the immediate future we will not make fundamental changes to the benefit structure. However, we have bold ambitions and have already identified a number of ways to provide disabled people with a different experience when accessing the support that they are entitled to, from pre-application right through the learner journey to when a decision is made. As we continue to balance the Scottish budget, challenging decisions will have to be made about any new policy suggestions we receive, ensuring that any new changes are affordable and present value for money. An example, we recently explored in a position paper the option of introducing a mobility element to the disability assistance for older people, the Scottish replacement for attendance allowance. The clear and significant financial implications estimated to be in the region of £580 million per year, along with other identified risks, resulted in our decision not to pursue this option. I'd like to move on now to talk about the programme of implementation. We are reforming welfare in Scotland and implementing a programme which is delivering the infrastructure necessary for a brand new service for Scotland, ensuring that the service meets the needs of the people of Scotland now and well into the future. The new assets are an investment in the Scottish public services which will facilitate the delivery of the devolved social security system for decades to come. Our investment in the Social Security programme represents less than 0.5% of benefit expenditure over the next 30 years. That is £651 million of programme implementation to 2024-25, compared to an estimated £150 billion in benefit expenditure to 2050. We are investing £170 million in 2021 to continue the programme of implementation. The Social Security programme continues at pace, delivering on the commitments the Scottish Government made. And as the Auditor-General stated in the report in May 2019, the programme is already working at a high pace. Given the emphasis on safe and secure delivery and the complexity and scale of work ahead, it is difficult to see how the programme could progress more quickly. We are building a brand new service, public service for Scotland, from the ground up. A service that has been co-designed with our clients, ensuring it meets the needs of the people of Scotland now and well into the future. We have always been clear that the process of devolution must be safe and secure, and Parliament has endorsed this approach on a number of occasions. I talk often about the complexities of the implementation programme and how we're using agile methodology to manage these complexities. Committee members took the opportunity to visit programme staff in Victoria Quay and see that agile programme in action. The hard work and dedication that the staff working in the Social Security programme and indeed of course the agency have demonstrated their commitment to designing and delivering a fairer, more inclusive system is to be commended. In 2018-19, the Social Security Scotland provided £190 million in payments to more than 91,000 people across Scotland. This financial year, 2019-20, it expects to spend around £341 million. Once fully operational, Social Security Scotland will administer around £4.2 billion in payments per annum and employ in excess of 1,900 people across central and local functions. We are delivering efficiency while also responding to the wishes of the people who are using it by providing a service based on human interaction rather than digital by default. We aim to have running costs that are broadly the same as the current UK system, measured as a percentage of benefit expenditure. In 2021, we are investing £186 million in Social Security Scotland to ensure £3.3 billion of benefit expenditure gets to the people who need it most. To conclude, Convener, making sure that everyone gets the financial support is a basic step in putting dignity, fairness and respect at the heart of our social security system in Scotland, a key principle of our Act, which is why we will continue to ensure our systems and processes are simple and inclusive. We will seek to remove barriers and we will continue to promote the take-up of our benefits. And I look forward to the committee's questions.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That was a lengthy statement, but I suppose that reflects the increase in powers and funds and budgets at your disposal as Social Security Scotland grows accordingly. But we might start with some scrutiny and something the committee has consistently been looking at over a number of years now, and that is of course the money available for the Scottish Welfare Fund. I think the first thing I would state is, since my time as a convener on this committee, and I think Claire Adamson beforehand, which had chaired this committee, we had called for an increase in funds for the Scottish Welfare Fund consistently over a number of years. So I would firstly put on record on behalf of the committee we absolutely welcome that. I can see from what the numbers we have at our disposal that increase from 33 million to 35.5 million in terms of money out to vulnerable individuals with grants and who are in crisis. So we welcome that, but can I ask you how you arrived at that particular increase?
Well, I do recognise the work that the committee has done on this over the years, and I appreciate the letters I have had from the convener to suggest that we do look very seriously at an increase in the benefit overall expenditure on this benefit. I think when we're looking at all of these options as we move forward, I was very keen that we made not simply an increase by inflation, but an increase that recognised that there are increasing demands in different areas of the country because of UK government welfare changes. I feel this is not just a reasonable increase, but a substantial increase of, as I said in my opening remarks, nearly 8%. And obviously the funding formula is agreed by COSLA and how that goes out, which is by SIMD figures. And that's the way, obviously, that this increase will be fed into the usual formula that goes through.
Okay, thank you. I suppose it would be helpful to know a little bit more about whether you think the current SIMD formula is fit for purpose. Let me put on record, first of all, that absolutely we have to target the Scottish Welfare Fund at areas such as my constituency where there's an absolute desperate need to give crisis grants and support to vulnerable constituents of mine. But Glasgow is one of the local authorities who will easily spend the Scottish Welfare Fund and then some more. Again, I understand that some local authorities in previous years had not been spending their full allocation. So I hate to say use it or lose it, but if I've got a local authority who is spending all their allowance and then providing additionality from time to time, I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about how we make sure the money goes to those most in need and the local authorities that are being most proactive in trying to help the most vulnerable.
Well, the figure, the formula that was arrived at in agreement with COSLA, and of course any change to that formula would obviously be done in partnership with COSLA. I'm open to suggestions if COSLA or stakeholders for that matter indeed come forward with a different proposition. The formula itself is still quite new. It's just bedded in within local authorities. So from a government perspective, I'm certainly not looking at a change in that. But as I say, I'm absolutely open if others wish to suggest that. We are also carrying out some evidence gathering around the Scottish Welfare Fund in conjunction with COSLA, and I am keen to have a review of the effectiveness of the Scottish Welfare Fund and have ongoing discussions with COSLA on that basis. So I'm not against any changes to these. It's certainly not something that the government's proactively looking at this point, but we are keen to work with partners in local government to ensure that the scheme's working effectively as possible.
Okay, I should point out, I wish COSLA might use SIMD more often in funding formulas to local government. I believe that's a powerful tool to get money to where it has to go, but I'm just conscious that some local authorities are underspending, some are spending and then some, and it's how that gets reconciled. So I welcome the comments that you've made there. You mentioned the amount of households that had benefited from the Scottish Welfare Fund each year. Have you made any estimates how many additional households and individuals might benefit from this uplift? Will this be the same amount of individuals getting a little bit more cash to help them in tough times, or will it be more grants awarded? Do you have an idea what that might look like, or is it all local discretion?
Well, it really is up to the local authorities themselves. I mean, the overall budget is set by the Scottish Government. The formula, as I say, is agreed via COSLA on how that is then distributed, and it really is then up to the local authorities to administer that budget in a way that fits their local needs. So I don't think it's right or proper for the Scottish Government to dictate or suggest direction of travel on that, because it may very well vary in different parts of the country depending on the local circumstances.
Okay, but you will follow the money through to work out how effective it is in different parts of the country.
Yep.
Is this unique to Scotland, or are there other parts of the UK that are trying to use similar tools and devices to help what I would personally describe as mitigation of UK austerity and the social and human consequences of benefits caps, benefit freezes and sanctions and the like across the UK? Are there examples of this happening elsewhere in the UK, and is there a comparison for what the Scottish Government approach has been in this, perhaps in relation to some other parts of the UK?
There's certainly nothing quite like the Scottish Welfare Fund that's available to this extent. And I give the example particularly in this case in England. There was recent research that was completed following the devolution of the Scottish Welfare Fund to Scotland. Some research was undertaken about therefore what was happening in England. And there certainly is examples of some local authorities moving to much less assistance than was available in what was called the National Crisis Loans and Community Care Grant arrangements, and certainly we can provide the committee with more information on those aspects, but it certainly seems to be an area where there are concerns, particularly in England, around some of the restrictions that local authorities have put in place due to the restrictions on their budgets overall.
Okay, thank you. Now, I mentioned in my last question that I would sit this within the idea of austerity mitigation approaches by the Scottish Government. I think the Scottish Government's used a figure, sorry if I've got this wrong, but I think when you include discretionary housing payments and the other aspects of the social security budget and the like, it's about £110 million. Is that money that you have to find from elsewhere? Does it take away from other things that you have to do? How do you get to £110 million and decide that's an appropriate spend on mitigation of what is essentially UK government policies that I personally would not be supportive of, but I am grateful that the Scottish Government is spending £110 million plugging that gap. So how do you arrive at £110 million, and what does that, what are the consequences for the Scottish budget in relation to that?
Well, there is absolutely consequences to the Scottish budget on this. Obviously, we work within a fixed budget. So in 2018-19, when the child poverty delivery plan was developed, it suggested in that what the Scottish Government was investing £1.4 billion to support low-income households. £527 million was targeted directly at children in low-income families. When you refer to actually the mitigation measures in particular, we were estimating 2019-20 that we would invest £110 million for that, and we do anticipate that in the following, in this coming financial year, we will be investing averagely approximately the same amount, £110 million in the next financial year on welfare mitigation as well.
Okay, and I mean, 'cause as a committee, and we have to make recommendations as a committee, and we obviously, if we identify additional expenditures we'd like to see in social security, we have to say where it would come from. If you had more cash available, I suspect you don't, Cabinet Secretary, but is there more that you would like to mitigate? What would your priorities be if you had more cash to spend, I suppose, is the question, because that's £110 million that could be spent on other places.
Well, I mean, I give the example simply if the bedroom tax was to end at a UK level, that would be £60 million that could be spent within the Scottish block grant for other measures. Obviously, we could do a lot with another £60 million in social security, and I'm sure committee members and myself would have views on how we could do that, but it simply is the fact that there is no more additional funding this year. The budget is fully spent, and therefore every pound that we are spending in mitigation against UK government austerity is money that we therefore can't spend proactively on aspects, for example, tackling child poverty.
I'm sure this committee could spend £60 million quite easily
in a heartbeat,
if it was
I'm sure,
at our disposal, but I appreciate the constraints that you're under. I know there were some other questions from members around this theme. Before I move on, does anyone want to come in relation to this theme? Alison Johnson, yeah.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned COSLA's input in the discussion around the Scottish Welfare Fund and the increase that has occurred, but we've had, the conveners pointed out, we've had some local authorities who have spent the lot and would like more to be able to help mitigate circumstances for people who are really struggling. But we've also heard from other local authorities who've said that they've been struggling to meet demand and they haven't advertised their funds for fear of inviting more people to ask for help than they can actually help. And I'm just wondering what discussion you've had with those local authorities.
Well, as I said to the convener, that's exactly why my officials are working with COSLA on the evidence gathering about what is happening with the Scottish Welfare Fund, and the discussions around how that will work, and the local authorities that will take part in that are ongoing. But that's exactly why I'm keen that that work is done in partnership between my officials and COSLA. There are some local authorities who decide themselves to spend additional expenditure on the Scottish Welfare Fund in addition to what is allocated through the national formula. They're perfectly entitled to do so if they choose that. But I am aware, obviously, of the variations between different local authorities, the percentages that they spend and what time of the year that might be spent. That's exactly why we have a review that will look at the effectiveness of the fund, and why we're looking at that evidence gathering is to be able to tackle some of those questions which I think Alison Johnson is getting at.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else on this theme before I move on? Keith Ryan?
Thanks, Convener. Just on the Welfare Fund, can I plead that you stick with the idea of not interfering in what local authorities do. I think that's exactly the right approach. And there is a danger if the funds are allocated according to SIMD or poverty figures that larger authorities benefit in a free-for-all in that situation at the expense of smaller authorities. So I'd encourage that. I just wonder though about the idea, I think I'd mentioned at a previous committee, Cabinet Secretary, the idea that if some authorities are underspending, and there can be many reasons for that, and they may be spending more on anti-poverty measures elsewhere, if they're underspending and some are overspending and there's real pressure, surely really the remedy should come from COSLA. They could quite easily have a top slicing where they had an insurance policy, if you like, so those that required more got more from the unspent funds, rather than, it can't be the case that government always puts in more. I'm not denying there's more of a demand, but there's got to be a recognition of where the underspend should help to address that rather than just additional money. And is that something you've given thought to when you've looked at this?
Yeah, I mean, as I said to the convener, it's not something we're proactively looking at change within government, but as I say, if people have a proposal, a suggestion on the formula working in a different, better way, that's up to stakeholders, to the committee, to COSLA themselves to come forward from that. Certainly from my standing, we're not looking at like, this is it, this is the formula, and I'm not interested in looking at it. I would say, as I said to the convener, it's only been recently looked at, it's just bedded down into that formula. But certainly if there are suggestions and proposals about how the money could be distributed in a different method, then if partners wanted to come forward with that, that would be up to them to do that.
Okay, we'll move on now, and we'll go to the Deputy Convener, Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. So the general area that I wanted to question you on is some concerns I have around the block grant adjustments, the reconciliation of the benefits, full transfer, and the impact that that will have on the rest of the Scottish budget. So I'm aware that the UK block grant to the Scottish Government is increased to reflect the devolution of disability and carers benefits. It's worth pointing out that so the smaller benefits are calculated using the normal Barnett formula. So we have the figures in front of us which show what the forecast was for things like attendance allowance, DLA, PIP. So you can see that there are some differences. So I'm also aware that the final reconciliation of disability spending comes in at 2021. So my first question is really just that I'm also certain in my own mind that there's going to come a point where all the forecasting and reconciliation will end, and then we're on our own, if you like. It's a demand-led budget. So whatever we have to spend through the block grant adjustment going forward in the terms of the new agency means that you have to spend that money. And I just wondered if you had any concerns about that, if the actual spend is over the forecasting, and that's going to have implications for the rest of the Scottish budget. Do you have any concerns yourself about that?
I think it is absolutely something that we are going to have to be, as a government, and I would suggest as a parliament, particularly cognisant of. This will continue every year moving forward. We will always have our budgets based on forecasting from the Fiscal Commission, but we will always have block grant adjustments being made if they're required to be made. I think one of the areas where it's I think particularly interesting and challenging is that this doesn't happen in one financial year. It can happen over a number of financial years, and I'll perhaps bring in Kevin Stevens to talk particularly about some of these aspects in a minute. But it is not a concern, but I think it's just something we have to be exceptionally live to. I mentioned in my opening statement around what can happen just if forecasting is incorrect in year. It can be a particular challenge. Now that would be managed in year in the usual manners, but we are obviously talking about a much greater, a much larger demand-led budget than the Scottish Government has ever had in the past. So that presents challenges. I'm content we have exceptionally close working relationships between Social Security Finance and overall finance officials to make sure that any variance that we see happening during the year is being flagged up very quickly to finance colleagues and to the Finance Secretary, and we will deliver that in year as we have to manage our budget. When we're looking at the block grant adjustment, that doesn't just happen, or doesn't happen in 1 year. The outturn figures will come, and we will have to deal with that in the future financial years. And that may be up, and it may be down, and it may likely take money from at some point. Will inevitably mean that it will be in effect taking money from the overall budget if we're having to deal with it in that manner. So perhaps bring Kevin in to deal with some of these areas, because it would be fair to say I think the block grant adjustments are one of the most complex areas of the budget, but they're also one of the most serious, given how large the numbers might be as we move forward.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Yes, indeed, this is a complex area, and there are different strands to the question there. I think, firstly, I'd like to answer the question by adding more colour around the risks around the block grant adjustment process. So the overall level of the Scottish budget is influenced by the interplay, the interaction between the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts and the forecasts provided by the Office of Budget Responsibility. This year, because of the timing of the UK budget, the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts are using much more recent data than the Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts. So the forecasts that are underpinning the block grant adjustments come from the OBR. They are about a year old. The Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts, which inform our budget here in Scotland, are much more recent. So there is a difference there. So the OBR will update their block grant adjustment forecasts at the time of the UK budget, and those figures will be available to the Scottish Government when the UK budget happens on the 11th of March. And these updated BGAs can be incorporated into the Scottish Government's budget if it so chooses. And then the second part of the question is around the risks around demand-led spending. So clearly, clearly it's very important for the Scottish Fiscal Commission to understand what the Scottish Government is doing around the service design of benefits and work around uptake and what have you, so that this information can be incorporated into their forecasts to ensure that their forecasts are as accurate as possible. Combined with that, officials in Social Security and the agency work very closely with our colleagues in Central Finance Directorates in the SG to ensure that there's a really robust understanding of what the in-year position is going to be. And I think the final point I would make as well, and this is illustrated in, I think it's Appendix A of the Scottish Budget document, around page 245, where there is a discussion on the use of the resource borrowing powers that the Scottish Government has, the limited resource borrowing powers, and how an element of resource borrowing is used to support the difference created by the outturn reconciliation process.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed that you know the page number, and it's very complex indeed. Now, I'm not even clear in my own mind about the reconciliation process. I just want to ask you about that. So in my note, as I read out there, so the block grant, Scottish Government is increased to reflect the devolution of disability and carer benefits. Smaller benefits are calculated using the normal Barnett formula. So is there an end point where the reconciliation, so that is that ongoing?
Yes, because we'll continuously have forecasting that goes on. We'll continuously have estimates from the OBR, so we will always have that reconciliation that will
with the UK government.
With the UK government. So this is now just part of our budget process. It would be fair to say it leads to a great deal of complexity, and because the outturn figures in effect obviously happen and we deal with it in the next financial year rather than the financial year
that's
that actually
helpful,
happened.
I didn't fully understand that, and that means to me there's a bit less risk then, because you can adjust quicker, because to me it would be deeply concerning if the Scottish Government had to use borrowing powers that are meant to be used against the whole budget and not just social security. So you want to avoid that. But from what you're saying is that, well, obviously the forecasting is absolutely the critical thing. If we can get that right, then there's less risk. And if we get that wrong, then that can be adjusted to, suppose, the following year. So that's fairly quickly. So if we had to use borrowing powers, for example, would that be short term?
We may indeed have to use borrowing or have to use reserves at any point to deal with the reconciliations that take place. I mean, it really simply depends on how large these are. Again, I go back to the fact that these are demand-led budgets, and the fact particularly that some of them are new, and particularly even the ones that we're transferring over, but it's exceptionally difficult to forecast behavioural change, for example, and the impact behavioural change will have as we move forward. It would be fair to say this is one of the areas where
I understand
there's a great deal
that,
of
yeah.
risk.
That's one thing I do totally understand, and you've spoken about it many times. So I was looking at the PIP, for example, forecast is, well, it's not wildly out, it's about 18 million, which I don't think is that big, but that 18 million may have to be found if it's out by 18 million.
And it could be when we move on to PIP, and this will actually obviously affect the year after's budget rather than the budget that we're talking about just now, because with PIP coming in, a replacement to PIP coming in early 2021, there'll just be a proportion of this budget that is affected by PIP. But when we're moving forward to future years, and again, I would use the examples of behavioural change, we may see those numbers, being much greater and being exceptionally difficult for the Fiscal Commission to forecast. Again, behavioural changes are perhaps one of the most difficult areas. So this is an ongoing challenge. It is something that we will have to look at very seriously every year. The borrowing and reserves are there to look to manage that, although I would say one of the reasons why the review of the fiscal framework is exceptionally important is when we're looking at how to deal with these reconciliations on a social security level. The challenge, the questions certainly the government will be looking at and the Parliament may be interested in is, does the current fiscal framework actually, will that work satisfactorily to deal with the level of reconciliations that may happen in the future?
And that is the area I think the committee would want to look further at. Perhaps, Kevin, if you want to explain one more thing to me, just so I'm clear. In my note, it says the final reconciliation for disability spending is 2021. What does that mean then? Because when I read it, I thought that means that after that, that's the red circling of the disability budget going forward. But what you're saying is, no, that's adjusted by the block grant every year.
I'm not sure I understand the specific figure that you're referring to.
It's more the principle of the note as the final reconciliation and disability spending is in 2020. So I thought that meant...
Yeah, so there's it's effectively a 3-year cycle. So, for example, if you take this year's budget, the 2021 Scottish Government budget reflects the 2018-19 adjustment for carers allowance, and because each year the outturn becomes available in September, and so thinking about the timing of when the Scottish Government budget is and the year-end outturn of the benefit figures, there is a catch-up process. So it's effectively a timing difference. But over time, this is what I'm saying. So when the OBR release their new forecasts at the time of the UK budget, it could be the case that this gap is smaller, or it could be larger, depending on what the OBR forecasts are. But it is a continuous cycle.
Question. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. So given the possible risks, have you had the Cabinet Secretary any opportunity to discuss that with your Cabinet Secretary colleagues for finance, for example?
I mean, it's obviously something we've discussed at Cabinet in general, is obviously the differences that are brought to the overall Scottish budget because of the devolution of the social security budget, and the demand-led feature of that is something which the whole of Cabinet is very alive to, because if we are going back in year, because there's, you know, this is not the block grant adjustments, but just change in year demand figures. That is something which will have to be reconciled in the Scottish budget. That's obviously something not just I, but the rest of my cabinet colleagues will need to be very live to as well, because it will need to be found either in the budget that is set, or through the use of borrowing and reserves.
Thank you very much.
Okay, can I just check something just before we move on? Demand-led budgets, absolutely. Our committee's doing a benefit entitlement and uptake inquiry, of course. Demand's one aspect of the overall financial exposure on any budget. Uptake as well is obviously relevant to that, and the government's got to estimate uptakes when they make their financial assumptions. I don't want to pick any individual benefit entitlement, because my colleagues will want to look at those in a bit more detail later, but there's a whole range of devolved benefits now where the Scottish Government has to have estimated uptakes in relation to that. So when you set a budget line for that, do you go for a midpoint position? So do you think, well, we think it might be 70% uptake, but we'll forecast for 75 to give a bit of flexibility in relation to the overall budget allocation? Or do you give headroom for anticipated, we would like to think, additional uptake on budgets? Because that inquiry we have is about trying to incentivise and encourage vulnerable people to apply for the benefits they're entitled to, and I'm just wondering how much of that is fed into the actual numbers we're looking at here this morning.
The budget is based on the Scottish Fiscal Commission's forecasting. We have obviously an exceptionally close working relationship with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, where my officials are working with them both in terms of, so the Fiscal Commission can understand our modelling within government, can understand any policy changes that it's being made within government that would be different to anything we've inherited from the DWP, and then the Fiscal Commission's forecasting is then what is used and inserted into the Scottish Government budget.
Okay, now this would be a nice problem to have, Cabinet Secretary, but if those forecasts, nothing's an exact science, if those forecasts come back in and across the board there's a 4% increased uptake separate from the Fiscal Commission's forecast and estimates, which government has to use, what contingencies would you use to make sure in a demand-led budget that all payments are made and honoured?
Well, that will need to be met in year. As I've mentioned before, we have, and indeed Kevin Stevens has mentioned before as well, we have exceptionally close working relationships between my officials and central finance officials, so that absolutely month by month during the year we're flagging up any changes that are actually happening to central finance to suggest any fluctuations either up or down, and it will simply need to be managed in year. I mean, there are no other options for the Scottish Government to do but to manage it in year. Yes, there are very limited borrowing and reserve powers, but that's why the management of the budget in year is exceptionally important, and that relationship with central finance is exceptionally important to flag that up, because it will have an impact on the overall Scottish budget.
I get the challenges that must face, but it's the kind of headache this committee would like to see. We want to encourage to maximise benefit uptake. So the reason for asking that question. Thank you for those reassurances. Alistair Allen.
Thank you very much, Convener. A feature of everything, or perhaps not everything, but close to everything you do is the interaction that you have with the DWP. And I just wonder if you could say more about the agency agreements and why costs around them have changed.
So the agency agreements are obviously a way of working to ensure that that we can deliver on a safe and secure transition. It's exceptionally important that we can do that because otherwise we would be looking at, in effect, a big bang approach of devolution rather than the safe and secure transition, which both Audit Scotland and this Parliament indeed have reflected is the correct way of doing these at this time. The agency agreements will be developed on a case-by-case basis with the DWP, and we have some that are in place at the moment and some that will be signed off in due course. So they're signed off as and when required. The aspects around how the agency agreement funds are, how the agency agreement numbers are agreed is by the discussions between the Scottish Government and the DWP. I think it's probably very important to stress that these are at cost, so it's how much it costs the DWP to deliver a system on the Scottish Government's behalf, and that will be developed on a case-by-case basis. They'll obviously decrease over time as we move forward with case transfer, so we'll get to the point once agencies at steady state that we will see the agency agreements coming down from that, because it's then being delivered by Social Security Scotland. There are some that will continue. Some of that, for example, is around the interaction of data between the DWP and Scottish Governments. And so, for example, we have one on Best Start grant, which allows us to access data from the DWP. Types like that will obviously have to continue because we have joint clients and a responsibility to be able to access information for us to be able to move forward for that. So I hope that gives a kind of explanation of where we're at in terms of the agency agreements that we have in place. The agency agreements will be, as I say, agreed on a case-by-case basis and will decrease as we move forward with the case transfer that will end 24-25, and the limited agency agreements will move on after that date.
Thank you. You mentioned that you would see a declining role for most agency agreements. Would you identify any challenges around the whole area of agency agreements in terms of managing the relationship with the DWP over these things?
I mean, obviously, one of the areas where agency agreements prevent us from doing something is around the fact that an agency agreement is based on the fact that there can be no policy changes made while an agency agreement is in place. That is why when we moved to an agency agreement with carers allowance, we did something separate, which was the carers allowance supplement, which allowed us to have the agency agreement, but allowed us to move exceptionally quickly. And indeed, the first thing we did was the carers allowance supplement. The other aspect moving forward, which we've looked at very seriously, and which I have agreement with the DWP on, is that there will be a halt in the transfer of people from DLA to PIP under the DWP when we have our agency agreement, because obviously there's a concern that we have had as a government over a long time over PIP, that we had asked for a halt to the transfer of people from DLA to PIP and have done for years, and I would have been exceptionally uncomfortable if during any time where we had an agency agreement we were still seeing people moved over from DLA to PIP. So one of the aspects that has been agreed with the DWP, and I'm grateful for their work on this, is that halt of transfer from people onto PIP during that process.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Mr. Balfour, I know you've got a number of questions you want to ask, but I'll take you in for one of them just now,
Okay.
so other members can come in.
Yep. Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you for coming. I would just want to go back to your statement you made in my papers around disability assistance for older people and working age people. When I think in your statement this morning you said by early 2021 you hope to have a benefit absolutely running here. From my understanding, I have to say, I only got a C at maths O level, so everything has to be put in those round figures. There's nothing within the budget for this year's budget, which would presume, does that mean when you say early 21, that will be into 21-22's budget before we see that up and running?
No, there was a discussion around with the Scottish Fiscal Commission around what they could estimate around our replacement to PIP, and because we're very much still in the policy development around aspects to do with our replacement to PIP, then what the Fiscal Commission, and I'm fully in agreement with this, what they've done when they've looked at their forecasting is looked at what would be happening under PIP, and they've forecasted for that. When we're moving forward with further policy development, as we're looking at the changes that we of course do want to make to PIP, then we will be obviously telling the Scottish Fiscal Commission about that, and they have the opportunity in the future to be able to revise their forecasts if they feel that the changes that we wish to make to our replacement to PIP would change the figure in the budget. So that's the reason why there's no kind of differential between what would be happening under DWP PIP and our disability assistance for working age people. It's because we will work with the Fiscal Commission during this financial year to develop the policies further and for them to make that forecasting decision.
Oh, okay, that's very helpful. I suppose going back to the Deputy Convener's point, I suppose we may come back to this a lot in the next 2 or 3 years, is if at some point in 2021 this benefit is being fully administrated by the agency and we've got the new rules for the Scottish PIP, there will be a 2 or 3 month period then presumably where there may well be a differential, and if that differential goes up, one of the comments from your colleague Kate Forbes is that there's no more money under the settee. How do you pay for that in that 2 or 3 month period?
It's absolutely a comment she very much makes in Cabinet as well, not just to the opposition spokespeople, I can assure you. I go back to the fact that it absolutely has to be found in year by looking at either, obviously the first port of call is the social security portfolio budget, and can it be managed within year within our portfolio budget, then the overall wider Scottish budget that is there. And of course then there is obviously the limited reserves and borrowing issues. Absolutely, Kate Forbes is correct. There's no contingency that's sitting here either for my demand-led budget or for opposition party spokespeople on these aspects. It will go through exactly the same challenges in year. It'll be my portfolio budget, the entire Scottish budget, and if it can't be met through that, it simply has to be met through reserves or borrowing.
I suppose, just to finish this one point, I suppose from a committee perspective, the sooner that we can know that date and know exactly what the regulations are, the better that we can scrutinise that. And I suppose the plea for me certainly, and I'm sure from others within the committee, would be to have us, as soon as Scottish Government know that, to let us as a committee have that scrutiny period, particularly around the financial side of it. Absolutely,
and I can fully appreciate that, because certainly some of the aspects when people are looking at what might look on the face of it as a small minor change, when we're looking at the size of disability assistance for working age people, are into the tens and usually hundreds of millions of pounds. So this is, it would be fair to say, something that's focusing my mind as we move through this. One of the challenges is, and this isn't a criticism of the DWP, it's because it's a joint-led programme, we will be very careful as we're moving forward with our proposals that we obviously have to work with the DWP to tell them what we are proposing and to see whether there's any implications for the DWP. And we've spoken committee at length, so I won't labour the point at this point, around spillover. So if we are suggesting a change, what is the spillover effect for passported benefits, etc.? So I absolutely would recognise the committee needs to know that as soon as possible. It's something that we're working at pace on, and particularly working with the DWP on, because we will ensure that they're aware of what we would like to do, and then they need to tell us whether there's an implication to that, and if there are implications, I need to have a very serious hard think about how you fund those implications if it comes back, and I will be as transparent as possible as we can. But once those discussions have happened, I think that's only fair, not just to the Scottish Government, for the DWP as well, as we work through that, and I appreciate the time that as they move through this discussion process with us.
Grateful. Okay, we'll get you back in later for your next question. Mark Griffin.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I think it's fair to say we've had robust debates in the past about uprating, and I wanted to talk about uprating, or the lack of uprating, for the Best Start grant. Because while we've had those robust debates, I didn't think for a second that we'd be looking at no uprating at all for social security benefits. And in fact, I was shocked to see effectively a Tory-style benefit freeze applied to a flagship government social security policy, that is Best Start grant. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary why the Best Start grant is not being uprated and who took that decision?
Well, I take that decision. I'm fully responsible for that as the Cabinet Secretary. I read with interest the piece in the Daily Record and Mark Griffin's extensive comments this morning, wishing the Best Start grant to go up with uprating, which would have went up by £10. I would point out to the committee that actually a child that will be eligible for the Best Start grant will obviously be eligible for the Scottish Child Payment. So rather than going up by £10, it will actually go up by £520 per annum. Because that's the additional money that a child that would be eligible for a Best Start grant will actually get thanks to the Scottish Government this year. Not £10, but £520.
Okay, I'll come back to that point, but the Cabinet Secretary, you've said that you signed off that decision. Can I ask if you made representations to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance before you signed off that decision to ask for funds to uprate the Best Start grant?
We always have discussions in Cabinet and around all of these aspects, but certainly the Finance Secretary is hugely supportive of the work that both myself and Eileen Campbell have been doing on the Scottish Child Payment, that, as I say, will actually increase the funding available per child by £520 this year.
Okay, that increase won't come about until after a child is born and a family qualifies for that payment. The point of the Best Start grant is to provide funds in advance to pay for things or to contribute towards things like a buggy, a cot, a car seat, baby clothes, nappies, all those things that families desperately need before the baby's born to be ready. Now, a family who had a baby and applied for that fund in December 2018 will have received a Best Start grant at a higher level in real terms than a family who will apply for a Best Start grant for their first baby and not be eligible for Scottish Child Payment until the baby's born, and so support for those crucial big purchases before the baby arrives. So there is no increase for those families. There is in fact a decrease in the money they have available to buy a cot, buy a buggy, buy a car seat. Do you not think that, given the Scottish Child Payment doesn't come into place until later this year, and that it's not, families aren't eligible for it until after a baby's born, that the Best Start grant should have been uprated?
Well, I would again point to the fact that the Best Start grant is one aspect that this government is undertaken to support children and young people. Yes, it can be applied for during pregnancy. Many people apply after pregnancy. This is the decision that the government has taken. I would give the example, if someone is eligible for the Best Start baby and pregnancy first payment, the Scottish Child Payment and the Best Start Foods, that would give a total of £1,572 that we would be eligible for. If Mr Griffin doesn't think that
But
that is...
after the child is born, not
If
before.
Mr Griffin doesn't think that's appropriate, I look forward to the Labour Party bringing forward a concrete proposal to the budget and negotiations about where that money will come from, because it will have to come from somewhere. So if anybody in the committee or the committee as an entirety doesn't agree with the decisions that I've proposed, then absolutely bring forward a concrete proposal saying where that money will come from, and obviously that will be discussed with the Finance Secretary as she goes through with budget negotiations.
Yep, and that's absolutely right. But what I can't believe is that in the planning for a budget, and when if I was planning for a budget, given the commitments and the principles that apply to social security and the arguments around adequacy, that a family who get Best Start payment this year will get a lower payment than they did last year, and the Cabinet Secretary talked about my own quotes in the Daily Record this morning, but I wasn't the only person quoted in the Daily Record this morning. Citizens Advice were quoted in the Daily Record this morning, and they said that they were disappointed with the decision to not uprate Best Start grant and called on the government to reverse that decision as soon as possible. Will the Cabinet Secretary reverse that decision?
Well, the budget is fully costed. There is no additional funding. If Mr Griffin was ever planning a budget as a Scottish Government Minister, he would have to then ask the Finance Secretary and indeed probably the First Minister how he would actually get that money when the budget is fully allocated. So again, I go back to the point, if a committee or members are not happy with what's being put forward here, then they have to come forward with concrete proposals about where that money is coming from. We'd again give the example that from 2021, a family with 2 children born up to a year apart could receive up to £10,000 by the time that that second child is 6, thanks to the work that this Scottish Government is undertaking. And I would again also point out that when the bill was going through, the Social Security bill was going through this Parliament, there could have been a decision at that point to obligate the Scottish Government to uprate Best Start grant. That wasn't put into the bill at that time. That was a bill that was unanimously agreed by Parliament at that point. As I say, if there are discussions around this budget in year, then it simply is a matter of members telling me where that money would come from.
I would say to the Cabinet Secretary that I think it is a mistake in the government's planning for this budget that they haven't included funds to uprate all social security expenditure, and that is a mistake that I would look to be corrected. Thank you, Convener.
I think
I'd simply point out then, if Mr Griffin would tell us how we correct it and where that money would come from, that is the other part of being a serious opposition party, is actually then saying not just you're disappointed, but what practically would you do about it?
Well, I'm sure we can continue that conversation with other members in the committee who also want to come in on that point. Can I just check something for clarity, and I'll let other members as well want to come in on this point? 2 things. During the discussion between the Cabinet Secretary and Mr Griffin, it was suggested that all Best Start payments are once the child is born. My understanding Best Start Foods was £4.25 a week during pregnancy. So is that financial support ahead of a child? Just for clarity, ahead of a child being born, can you get those payments during the period of pregnancy? My notes say that you can do.
It's my understanding as well, Convener. I can't find my direct annex, but from memory, yes.
Okay, so £4.25 a week Best Start Foods, irrespective of whether it's going up or down, just for clarity, there is financial support available before birth. The other question we'd have to ask is, in relation to the fast-tracking, the bringing forward of the Scottish Child Payment, what is the financial obligation in the coming financial year in relation to accelerating those payments?
Well, there is 2 aspects to that, I suppose. There are the aspects around the implementation costs of the implementation costs within programme that we have to do, and the actual expenditure on benefit. The expenditure on benefit is £21 million. That's within Ms Campbell's portfolio rather than my own portfolio return, but the implementation costs are within my portfolio.
And what are the implementation costs, Cabinet Secretary?
The implementation costs are, if you bear with me 1 second, 30 for this year. 30.
Yep. I'm not trying to catch out, Cabinet Secretary. I'm trying to look at the political choices we'll have to make, including this committee. When Cabinet was making decisions on whether to uprate or otherwise, were there competing priorities, including the acceleration in the early payment of the Scottish Child Payment to under 6s? Was that a factor in deciding not to uprate Best Start? Or was it a policy position generally irrespective of that? I think that's a reasonable question to ask.
Yeah, I think it was an aspect around, I suppose, the challenge that we're all given as Cabinet Secretaries is what are we doing about child poverty and the alleviation of child poverty? Given the work that the Scottish Government is doing around the Scottish child payments, say £21 million of benefit expenditure is planned this year, but obviously that's not a full financial year, and that's not the full rollout of the Scottish child payment. So as we look to the challenge of what is the aspect that we are looking to do that will create the largest effect, that was why the Scottish child payment is the area within the Scottish budget that particularly alleviates the child poverty aspects. So, for example, the policy costs in the first full year, so that wouldn't be the next financial, the 2021 financial year, but the year after that would be around 70 million for our first full financial year. And once we move to the first full year of full rollout for under 16s, that will come up to £180 million per year.
That's helpful. I'm just trying to, because we will, as a committee, discuss what our priorities may or may not be as a committee during budget scrutiny, but I was trying to get to the bottom of whether this was a overt policy choice simply not to uprate, or whether this was about prioritising what the government thought the best spend was of monies that were available. Because I might take the view the best spend would be early delivery of the Scottish child payment, but I would want a reassurance that it's not a ongoing policy of the Scottish Government for the medium term, for example, not to uprate these other benefits. I think that's a reasonable question to ask as the committee convener.
I mean, when it comes to the uprating in future years, these will be decisions that will be taken on a year-by-year basis. So it's absolutely not set in stone that there will be no change whatsoever. I would absolutely reassure the committee on that. The aspects around it, I think, are particularly pertinent this year because of the introduction to the Scottish child payment. Obviously, once the Scottish child payment is introduced for under 60s, we're in a completely different ballpark then, and we'll need to look in the next financial year about what can be done. And again, I would go back to around the challenge that government has around how do we eradicate child poverty and what are the best ways that we can do that. The Scottish child payment is obviously an ongoing payment, whereas aspects like the Best Start grant are a one-off support mechanism. So the reassurance, I hope, of an ongoing payment for the Scottish child payment will therefore allow us to deliver a big impact on child poverty, and that's exactly the reason why that was brought in at such an expedited pace.
Okay, 3 committee members wanting to ask additional supplementaries in relation to this team. Shona Robinson and then Alison Johnson.
So on that point about eradicating child poverty, you'll be aware that in December the IFS published analysis on the impact across the income distribution of both tax and welfare reforms in the UK from the period 2010 to 2019. And what that found was that households in the lowest income decile have lost an average 11% of their income. That's about £1,200 per year. And with those with children, the average loss rises to 20%, which is about £4,000. Now, given that, can you outline again, Cabinet Secretary, what action the Scottish Government has taken in terms of the benefits that you are establishing and what that will provide for a family? I think you used an example earlier on of 2 children under 6. It would be very helpful to hear that again in relation and contrast to the £4,000 that has been lost by families with children and which will continue to be lost by families with children elsewhere in the UK, presumably. So what will that mean for those families in terms of the decisions made by the Scottish Government?
Well, I think it is a particularly sobering report from the IFS. It really sets into great detail around the implications for changes in tax and benefit, and Shona Robinson has detailed some of those. I won't go through them again. I suppose it really does highlight why the introduction of the Scottish child payment is so important. Now, obviously, if there was changes at a UK level, then we would be able to have a much greater effect on child poverty, because we are seeing child poverty rates increase because of changes in what's happening at a UK level. We could do obviously so much more, therefore, with our investment of, as I said earlier, £180 million, if we weren't having to mitigate against low-income families falling further into poverty. And the one example which I think she gave, so my apologies if this is a duplication, but the aspect which I thought was particularly pertinent around it is that households in the lowest income decile have lost around 11% of their income, and among those with children the average loss is that £4,000, which I think is the area that Shona Robinson mentioned. That's why the Scottish Child Payment is so important. That's why the expedited timeline for the Scottish Child Payment is so particularly important, much significantly ahead of what we set out in the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. The point that I made earlier around the impact that that would have on a family, and I gave from the example of from 2021, a family with 2 children born up to a year apart could receive up to £10,000 by the time that that second child is 6, and that is the direct impact that the Scottish Government is determined to make to invest in families across Scotland at what is a difficult time, and particularly when they are seeing changes at a UK level that may be pushing them into poverty.
Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. Back to the issue of the Best Start grant. I mean, I appreciate that Scottish parents are still much better off with the Best Start grant than Sure Start, but that doesn't change the fact that the value of the 3 Best Start grants will decline each year unless they're uprated. And, you know, I know that the Scottish Government opposes the benefits freeze. Why not then uprate all benefits which the Scottish Government pays? You know, notwithstanding the Cabinet Secretary's comments regarding opposition input to the budget process, has the Scottish Government considered having that uprating as a general principle across the devolved system?
Well, the aspect around uprating is something which I give really serious consideration to on an annual basis. This year, when we're looking at a time where we've seen the Best Start grants coming in, and as Alison Johnson knows, as she said, a greater package than was ever available for the Sure Start maternity grant. We've seen that come in. We're now moving to the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment again, which will make £10 per week for every eligible child difference each year, a difference of £520 for the first full year that this will be in place. That's an exceptionally important impact that we are having for alleviating child poverty, but as I say, if you take it down to the impact that that will have on what is available for a family during this year, they will see the investment that the Scottish Government is putting into them not increase by £10, which it may have done if we'd uprated with Best Start grant, but we're actually seeing that go up by £10 per week now that the Scottish Child Payment's in. So that's why I absolutely will look at this really seriously every year. I'm not saying that this is what we'll do, even in the mid, never mind, kind of long-term basis. I will look at it absolutely every year. But in a year where we are investing £20 million this year, simply because it's not a full financial year, that £21 million, £70 million in the first full year rollout for Scottish Child Payment, I think the Government is doing a great deal to move forward as expeditiously as possible with the targets that have been set out in the Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan. Of course, it will be something that we'll come back to every year in every budget, though.
On that issue of uprating and the Scottish Child Payment in particular, we're all aware of how devalued child benefit was over the period. You'll be aware that the Scottish Commission on Social Security has recommended that uprating of the Scottish Child Payment be by the highest of CPI inflation or increases in earnings. And the rationale of this, obviously, is this payment is meant to reduce relative poverty and that poverty is linked to earnings. And in its report, the Commission says this would be the most effective way of ensuring that the Scottish Child Payment remains an effective way of reducing child poverty. So can I ask whether the Scottish Government has reached a view on whether to provide that double lock for the Scottish Child Payment?
So obviously we've had quite a few debates on uprating in the committee, and indeed I suppose in the Parliament as a whole as well on that aspect. Committee will be aware, and indeed we've discussed the report which the Scottish Government did ahead of this financial year coming, where we looked at the different options for uprating, presented that to SCOS and had that again further debated and recommended. And I'm certainly content with the way that we're moving forward on this aspect. When it comes to the actual specific recommendations that SCOS have made on the Scottish Child Payment, I haven't completed my decision making on that, so I'll get back to the committee in due course around the Scottish Child Payment one in particular. So at this point I can simply refer back to what the discussions we've had before, and I will of course inform the committee once we're looking at the Scottish Child Payment how the government will respond to that particular recommendation.
Thank you. Convener, I have another question on the Scottish Child Payment, but it doesn't relate specifically to uprating, so I don't know if you want me to push on. Or
I'll just double check, because there was one more supplementary on the Scottish Child Payment. I think it was Keith. If it's uprating, I'll take you just now, then I'll come back to Alison. Was it on uprating?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's about the political choices we made.
Right.
I'm happy to wait.
Why don't I to Alison first, then I'll take you in, Keith. Alison.
yeah, thank you, convener. Yeah, on the Scottish Child Payment more generally, how many eligible families take up the payment will have significant consequences for this in future budgets. And the Spice paper for today's meeting notes that there's a big difference between the Scottish Government estimate of 83% of people taking up the payment, equivalent to 340,000 children and £180 million, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission estimated take-up of 72%, that's by 2023-24. So that's 284,000 children and £157 million. So I just wondered if you could explain why there are two fairly different estimates out there in the first place.
Yep, sure. It comes down to, I suppose, how the forecasts are actually produced. And this will be something that we will look at over time, and of course the Fiscal Commission will look at over time. So when it comes to the Scottish Government's analysis, when we were undertaking our modelling options of the Scottish Child Payment, we were looking at a potential take-up based on the historic rates of child tax credit. So that was one of the aspects, or the main aspect, that we looked at for that. The Scottish Fiscal Commission have slightly different assumptions on that. Again, it's a challenging one because it's a brand new benefit on this. There's therefore no previous established baseline with a historic take-up for it. So they are and will, of course, review their assumptions in the light of latest evidence. They've assumed a lower take-up rate than we have, as Alison Johnson has put out. At the time the forecast was produced, we're obviously still sharing information with the Scottish Fiscal Commission around, for example, our communications and take-up strategy. That is obviously still very much in development, and we'll continue to share the further information that we have with the Fiscal Commission about the strategy to maximise benefit take-up. So it really does come down to forecasting assumptions. I would, of course, like to see it higher than the Fiscal Commission have laid out. And that's exactly why our modelling assumptions were based on something different. And that's why we will work with the Fiscal Commission during the year to look at exactly what we're putting in place to improve benefit take-up. So we've had some of these challenges in the past before, when perhaps some of the initial Best Start grant Fiscal Commission forecasts were lower than our modelling, and indeed then actually what happened, and that meant forecasting was changed. You may see this changing again in year as we move forward with one of the reasons why the Best Start grant forecasting from the Fiscal Commission changed was as they recognised the level of work that was going on around communications and take-up strategy and so on. So this may be something that will change from the Fiscal Commission's point of view, but that is entirely up to them and their forecasting to look at that.
I suppose at the very heart of this is the desire that everyone has to reduce child poverty. So if, are you satisfied that the child payment would get to enough eligible families to meet the target of 3%, that 3% reduction in relative child poverty, if we were meeting that lower Scottish Fiscal Commission estimate, and I think we have to bear in mind as well that there'll still be families who miss out because they don't claim the qualifying benefits in the first place. So I just have a concern around the take-up and the estimate.
Well, when it comes to the qualifying benefits, obviously that touches back onto spillover, which we've discussed at length previously, so I won't elaborate on that. I wouldn't be satisfied if we were sitting at the lower rate that's being forecast. Of course I wouldn't, because that's why our modelling was looking at something different, something larger, and there will always be a challenge that the Scottish Government's putting on itself to ensure that the benefit take-up rate is as high as it possibly can be. So absolutely that what we've set out in our modelling, and indeed the targets that have been set within the child poverty, tackling child poverty delivery plan, are the areas where the Scottish Government is focused on. So we need to shift that dial in the way that's in that delivery plan, and that's why the take-up for the Scottish child payment has to be at as high a rate as we can possibly get it. So I'll never be satisfied with a low forecast that would suggest that more families might miss out on something that they're eligible for. But that's why we'll work with the Fiscal Commission during this year to work on telling them about our benefit take-up and our communications programme, and then of course it is entirely up to them to independently then decide if the forecast needs to change from what they've described so far in the budget.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Keith Brown.
Yeah, it's just on the issue, Cabinet Secretary, about political choices and the impact on people, and we're at that stage in the budget process where that's what we're talking about. And you mentioned, and Sean Robertson mentioned as well, this example of £10,000 for a family with 2 children of a certain age. I'm just wondering, is that a direct comparison to, say, the rest of the UK, England and Wales? Is that more, 10,000, or are parts of that more than would happen elsewhere through political choices that have been made here?
So that is because of political choices that have been made here up in Scotland to ensure that we're providing support for low-income families, the Scottish Child Payment being the most obvious one. So those are the political choices we've made that will allow that determination to happen. So it would include the Scottish Child Payment, it will include Best Start Grant, it will include Best Start Foods, and all of those obviously have been increased from what is available. Some of them are available down south. Obviously the Scottish Child Payment is not available down south, but what we're seeing at a Scottish Government level is a higher rate available for even those ones that are a comparative from down south.
Okay, thanks for that. And also, you talked about the budget process and how all the budget is committed, and if anybody wants to change that, it will have to be accounted for by a change elsewhere. And I know we're at the earlier stage of that, but have you any indication of any likelihood of a genuine amendment to the budget to change what's been proposed in terms of this, or is this just, getting a headline in a newspaper? Do you think somebody will actually follow through with some of the suggestions, or as in previous years, we'll hear no more about it?
I'm not aware at this point that it's turning into a serious consideration that's in serious development with the Finance Secretary. Now, obviously, there are weeks to go in this process to see whether it turns into that type of serious consideration. But that will be when people will be able to tell whether it's a serious proposition or not.
And the last point, just obviously it is around political choices, and different parties can make different choices, and I understand the main opposition party said they're going to review all these areas. What would be the likely impact if you set up the systems which you're setting up and looking at the programme business case, if in, say, the next couple of years a change was made to eliminate some of the benefits which have been brought in? What would be the impact both in terms of cost and in terms of the staff that you're currently taking on? Have you any way, or have you considered that as you made your proposals?
we've certainly never considered doing away with any of the benefits that we have. So I wouldn't be able to estimate in terms of what would happen. When clearly the implementation costs have already been spent. The system is set up, and we have people in place to deliver those budgets. It would of course be quite easy to work out what would be cut from particular investments. So you would simply be able to look at the budget headings that we have within the chapter to see what the Scottish Government is currently paying out on, for example, Best Start Grant, Best Start Foods, and if any changes were to be made to review or to end those, and the figures are in the budget about what that would be, and obviously it would have an implication therefore on how much is being invested in low-income families.
Okay, I think we might slight bit adrift there, Mr Brown, perhaps, but I suppose bringing it back to specific budget scrutiny, we've all got our decisions to make, including as a committee, what we decide to recommend back to government as well. Thank you for that exchange. Before I take Michelle Ballantyne in, I will take you in a second, Michelle, the Deputy Convener, for a brief supplement.
Just very quickly, just with the exchange you had with Keith Brown there, and I presume that you would be happy to put on the record that it is a matter for this committee during the budget process, if we chose to take a different view about the uprating of any benefit, that's something that the committee can look at, and that's the point of the process.
Yeah,
it's not just a question of political parties being challenged.
No,
the
I think
committee
I said
itself can do this if it's so minded.
Yeah, I think I said during the earlier discussions that if it was to come from either individual members of the committee or indeed political parties, that could be suggestions that would go forward. The simple fact I point out is that every suggestion about how to spend money needs to then seriously look at where that money would come from. The government,
Yeah,
I'm
to
sure...
be fair, Cabinet Secretary, I think most of us have done a few budgets. We know that in the private session, if we come to an agreement or not, then we know that we have to tell you where we think the money should come from.
And I look forward to reading that.
There is perhaps, and I'll indulge that exchange slightly by saying in terms of budget processes in this place, I'm well aware, and I apologise for stating the obvious on record, but not everyone watching this session will necessarily know the obvious, that political parties tend to do negotiations, particularly as a minority government, in terms of whether budgets pass or not. There's been less of a culture in this Parliament where committees are actually able to shape the budget process and then secure gains within the budget, because we will leave the committees, we'll go back to our individual political parties, and those negotiations take a different nature altogether. So maybe that's something to look at in the future, the culture of the budget process in this place, that it could be committee led as much as it could be political party led in relation to amendments. So hopefully that's a useful exchange in terms of how we do our business in this place. As always, the very patient Michelle Ballantyne. Michelle, before you come in, I'm not sure if, given changes with the Conservative opposition group in this Parliament, whether or not this may or may not be your last committee here, but just in case it is, can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your time, efforts and patience in committee as well, and thank you for your work, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Needless to say, I want to turn to operating costs and budget in terms of the bit of scrutiny I want to do here with you. I hope it won't be a techie exchange, and I hope we will actually explore it. So, obviously, we've seen a significant cost rise in the implementation, more than double the original financial memorandum estimates, from 308 million to around 651 million. And obviously during this session we've been discussing bits of money here and there, but when we look at the increase in costs, we can see a significant amount of money that has been used. So I would like to just explore in a bit more detail what has led to those significant increases and how you're going to manage that going forward to make sure we don't see that continued increase. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about what impact that's had on decisions across the Scottish budget, because obviously that money's had to be found. This wasn't catered for in the fiscal framework. I think there was 200 million allocated for implementation originally. So we're looking at a big drift from that original amount. So it must have had some impact somewhere. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of those things, and then we can explore it from there, please?
Certainly, I mean, on the aspect of the £200 million through the fiscal framework, that was always said at that time that would pay a proportion. It was never supposed to be the full entirety of that. I think that was agreed and fully accepted by both governments at that time. We've obviously moved forward a great deal with what has been proposed and how the programme has developed. And when we look at the financial memorandum, for example, that was delivered as part of the Social Security bill as it was going through Parliament, there were initial estimates put on that. Again, it absolutely said in the financial memorandum that those were initial estimates and that these would change over time as policy decisions were taken. And I suppose one of the very early examples of that was actually how the financial memorandum moved from the early stages of that bill to the later stages of that bill, with changes that were made as the bill progressed. Obvious examples, I suppose, being short-term assistance, terminal illness and advocacy. I think the estimate for those changes that were just made in a bill process would come to £0.5 billion change in expenditure. So that's a demonstration of how the policy made changes made quite rightly and agreed by the Parliament obviously had an impact, and during that bill process to how changes will move forward.
But would they not have been part of the original financial memorandum?
No, because they were amendments that were made at stage 2 and 3. So that was exactly why a supplementary financial memorandum was made as part of the bill process. It wasn't something I was directly involved in. Some other members of the committee were. So there was actually a supplementary financial memorandum put out because there were significant changes that were being made during the bill process. So that's one example of how policy changes, whether it's made by government or made by Parliament, can make a difference to what goes on. The other aspects which we'll have to take into account, obviously, is how the programme has grown. So again, the most obvious example for that is the Scottish Child Payment. That wasn't envisaged to be something that was moving forward at the time that the bill was going through, and it certainly wasn't something that could therefore have been envisaged as the financial memorandum was being established. So there's another example, and quite a substantial example of a change that can be made. That will make obviously a change to the implementation costs and a change to the length of the programme. We then look at other aspects that have came into it, which again we were very clear in the financial memorandum couldn't be estimated at that point. I give one example because it's an area that's clearly out with our control and therefore out with our ability to estimate, was how much it would cost for the DWP to make the changes to their system that we are required to pay for to allow the linking between the two systems. So that's something which is clear. It was clear at the time wasn't going to be in the financial memorandum, and therefore is in addition as we move forward to what's been going through. You look at the size of the programme, it's obviously not just the 11 benefits that have been devolved. We're looking at 16 that will be delivered by Social Security Scotland, so the entire scope of the entire scope of the programme has changed, again, because of these policy decisions around the types of payments. One of the areas which the which the business case looks at is obviously looking at the good practice set down by HM Treasury around looking at the life cycle costs of the implementation. So when we look at that over the life cycle of the programme, which is estimated within that good practice to be around 30 years. We'll see £150 billion of benefit expenditure, and the implementation cost that we'll see is 0.5% of that cost. So that's the implementation costs in the context of how much will be spent over benefits over the life cycle of the programme.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I mean, taking on board all the points you've said there, the major increases in staffing, so some of the things you referred to in terms of IT costs to DWP, I don't know whether you can quantify those, but the figures I have here say that there's an increase of 22 million in IT costs from the original estimate, a decrease in estates, and an increase in staffing of £246 million, so 237% increase in the cost of staffing. Does that relate to your understanding of where you've got to? And if so, why such a huge increase in staffing? Because obviously you must have anticipated how many staff you would need roughly to deliver, or did you just not really understand the complexity of it when this was originally done?
Sure, it then goes back to the scope of the programme, and as I pointed out, the scope of the programme's changed. So when we were doing the financial memorandum, as I said earlier, there's no way we could have scoped in the staff that are required to then implement the Scottish Child Payment, because we didn't know we were doing it. So those aspects...
But we're not doing that yet.
No, we are building it now. So it is getting paid for now because we're building it now. So the implementation costs have begun because we are opening it by December. But again, I point out when we're looking at the whole of the business case, that's obviously taken account of the entirety of the Scottish Child Payment build all the way up to the under-16s. So that's one aspect that is mentioned earlier on about how the staffing levels will change. The programme is lasting longer than was initially estimated, and that's because of the safe and secure transition method, which the Parliament has endorsed, and which, as I quoted in my opening statement, Audit Scotland have said, I think from memory, it's difficult to see how the programme could be delivered quicker if safe and secure transition was the priority. I paraphrase, but the actual direct quote will be in my introductory statement. So there is a reasons around the staffing costs. The IT costs, I think, are a particularly interesting one. It's certainly an area where committee and certainly I take a very keen interest, given some of the challenges in previous public sector IT costs about whether that would rise. I think the important part of those aspects is that the IT costs have changed and increased because of the Scottish Child Payment. So if you actually take out the IT costs that are required for the Scottish Child Payment, it's pretty much bang on what was suggested in the financial memorandum, which is, I think, a testimony to how well the IT delivery has been managed, that public sector delivery has allowed, in effect, that to be delivered as was proposed within the financial memorandum. So I hope that's
helped. So the
helped.
Scottish Child Payment is costing £22 million to implement the IT?
Over time, yes. Yes, so the implementation this year is not obviously the only implementation cost that we'll actually see. So on the totality of what's happening over the actual business case, then it will be it will be the difference will be what the Scottish Child Payment is costing to deliver.
Okay. And on the in terms of moving to a steady state, you've suggested in here that in effect you will benefit from economies of scale, and that will bring down the cost to around 5% against outgoing payments. Can you just talk a little bit about where those economies of scale are going to come in? Because at the moment, obviously, the DWP are doing it under an agency agreement, which obviously appears to be quite cost effective in terms of that, in terms of moving, if I look at your business case graph. But also, you suggest that is significantly cheaper than the DWP's running costs, which you say are 6.3%. I had a figure of 3%. So out of my own curiosity, I will go back and actually review that and maybe drop you a line to see, how that pans out. But also, if you could go back in my first question, I asked you about the implications across the Scottish budget on these rising costs. And how that has impacted and what choices you've had to make as a result. Because obviously you said earlier and quite clearly to Mr Griffin that uprating the Best Start grant would mean political choices, but given the massive difference in costs, both in terms of implementation and now in terms of that steady running state against the original financial memorandums, presumably that has had an impact somewhere, and I just wondered where that impact has been.
Secretary, is there anything else you want to add, Michelle? Because Mr Balfour and Shona Robinson also want, and we take them in after this question, so this might be a last opportunity. Do you want to add anything else at this point?
No, I mean, the other thing I asked about at the beginning was risk in terms of going forward, whether you feel you've now got this under control and we're not going to see any further increases going forward.
Thank you.
So on that last point, I think many of the major decisions have now been made. That was the reason that the business case was adapted at this time. Wave 1 has been completed. The major policy decisions around Wave 2 are very much in a high state of readiness. So a lot of the large-scale decisions have been made on those aspects to it. Can I just touch on the steady state aspect of the agency, because I would respectfully disagree that costs have escalated on that from what's in the financial memorandum, and if convener Ms Ballantyne will bear with me, I'll give a couple of examples about why that is. The financial memorandum looked at these on a price basis of 2016-2017. And obviously this business case is looking at it very much in a different price framework. It's from memory 24-25. So when you take account of inflation and inflationary pressures, when you take account of the additional expenditure the agency will deliver upon because they will have to implement the Scottish Child Payment, that accounts for the differences between what was seen in a financial memorandum and the business case. So the changes are because of inflationary pressures and the Scottish Child Payment, which is obviously a very big change in what was anticipated that the agency would deliver. But if we actually look at the proportion of how much the agency costs as a proportion of how much benefit expenditure is made, it is round about the same percentage, again, as was in the financial memorandum. So actually the costs for the agency in steady state have not increased dramatically when you take account of inflationary pressures and the change in scope of the programme, the most obvious example of the investment in the Scottish Child Payment in that.
Well, inflationary uprating would take you to about 190 million for 2024. So you've got roughly a 63 million increase for the child payment. Is that what you're saying?
It's also when you look at aspects around pension contributions, for example, as well. So I'm talking about all inflationary pressures, but that is in essence why the changes have taken place. Is the changes, as I say, in inflationary pressures in the Scottish Child Payment. We're happy to provide more information and the actual figures on that,
be good.
But that's in essence, in summary, the breakdown of the reasons why that would change. Now, if Ms Ballantyne will forgive me, I think I have now missed out a part of her questioning.
The risk and where the money's come from, what suffered as a result of these increases.
Well, I think it really comes down again to the political choices that we do make as a government. We have been absolutely determined all the way through to ensure that we are investing in a system that is different. It's not a lift and shift. You know, we are therefore investing in a great deal of user research, for example, around application processes to test that, to make sure it's much better, and then every single part of that journey. So those are the areas where we have absolutely chosen to invest to make sure that we are getting a system that's not just fit for purpose but delivers for the people of Scotland, and that is a political choice that we've decided to invest in, and I absolutely think that is the right political choice to make. If we hadn't invested in changing application process, user involvement, how decisions are made, what the assessment process will change to, then it would in essence have been us lifting and shifting the same application form which people are inherently uncomfortable with just now, the same decision-making process and the same assessment process. That in essence might
risk of escalating costs going forward from this position.
Well, that might have in essence made it cheaper for us to deliver the programme. It wouldn't have been a good programme or delivered for the people of Scotland. It then really comes down to what happens in the future, and as I said earlier, we've made the major decisions around policy changes. Around that, there will be further public announcements that I'll be able to make in due course around disability assistance. But we know in essence the type of system that we're trying to achieve, and we've made major decisions and have had much better discussions just because of the time period with the DWP around house case transfer, for example. So those big decisions that would be made that would cause costs to change were at a much but a degree of maturity in the programme now that we've already looked really at those. Obviously, if there was a material change in circumstance in what we're doing within social security, then that would lead to a change, but that would be, as I say, materially different. That would be obvious not just to the government, but which I would have to tell Parliament and about any policy changes that would have an impact on that. But that's the type of area where you would see a change from what's already in the business cases if there was a dramatic change in a policy decision, or if we were looking to do something in a very different way than what we've already looked at within the maturity of the programme as it stands at the moment. But I'd be happy to provide some of the breakdown of that as I've mentioned to Ms Ballantyne.
I think given time, obviously there's not really time to explore it, but if you could give me a breakdown on how those figures and where the the inflation uplifts etc come from, and I'll share it with the committee once I get it. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Now we're going to roll these two questions together because we really do have to close this evidence session pretty quickly. So I'm going to ask both Jeremy and Shona to ask their questions, and it'll be a kind of final response, I'm afraid, from the Cabinet Secretary, because we need a brief bit of time in private before the plenary session of Parliament starts. Jeremy Balfour.
Just one of the reasons given in your paper for the difference in cost is that there will be a differential operating model adopted for assessment service. And that seems to be one of the reasons given for the increase in the capital spend. You've made it very clear that the number of assessments are going to be less under the new system. I'm just wondering how those two sit together.
We're absolutely... Oh, my apologies.
One bite of the cherry. We'll take Shona Robinson, and then you can answer both those questions.
Yeah, it's related to the last two really. You've talked a fair bit during the session about the building of a system, and how the contrast to that would have been what you described as the lift and shift. Could you say a little bit more about what the opportunity cost of doing that would have been, what the impact on service recipients would have been of not having a change in the application process, the forms, no advocacy, no Scottish Child Payment? What would the impact of that have been had you just done a lift and shift?
Okay. So on the first aspect around assessment, we are absolutely determined, indeed obligated, to significantly decrease the level of face-to-face assessments. That's why we're spending a great deal of time and effort making sure that the decision-making process, that entire client journey is very different to what happens at the moment. And that really does tie into Shona Robinson's question, handily, that we wouldn't have been able to do any of that had it been a lift and shift. We would have just taken the system as it is, and every MSP, I'm sure, will have constituency mailbags full of where people disagree with the current system, and that is all that would have been possible if a lift and shift had taken place. So one of the benefits of making sure that we are doing it in a safe and secure method over the programme life is that we can look at the assessment process in particular, which I hope committee, when they hear the details of, will be pleased and satisfied that what is coming forward will make a difference to people. The fact that we're not doing a lift and shift also means that we can future-proof our system for whatever may come in the future as well. So we're not obviously just delivering a system that delivers the benefits that we're doing at the moment, but we're also delivering everything that goes around that, that sits around it, whether it's back-end finance, redeterminations and appeals, all of that aspects. But we're also looking that it's one platform that then other aspects can be fitted into. So the reason Scottish Child Payment could be fitted into it is because it's one platform, and that would not have been possible had we done a lift and shift, or if we had something as a DWP have, where there's a myriad of different systems that need to talk to each other. And I'm getting the hint from the convener I should probably end there.
Apologies, Cabinet Secretary. I've tried to be as expansive as possible with scrutiny and what is a condensed period of time more generally for budget scrutiny in this place. That does conclude agenda item 2. Can I thank you and your officials for being here this morning. We now move to agenda item 3, which is still budget scrutiny, but we've agreed to take in private. So we move into private session, and I apologise for trying to rush members of the public out of the room so we can dispose of our business before Parliament starts. Thank you.